During my years as sheriff, I learned that some stories never make it into official reports. They survive in whispers, in averted glances, in the way grown men avoid certain places without knowing why. The Pacific Railroad was one of those places. And there was one story in particular, one that only returned when the moon vanished completely from the sky. On one of those new moon nights, darkness was more than the absence of light. It felt dense, almost alive, settling over the land like a shroud. Investigator Samuel Holbrook stood alone along an abandoned stretch of the Pacific Railroad, listening to his own uneven breathing. He didn't expect to find anything. His intention was simple: to put an end to stories he believed were nothing more than frontier superstition. Then, far ahead, the night seemed to tear open with a low metallic groan. A sickly yellow glow appeared where the tracks vanished into the horizon. There was no wind, no engine sound, only the slow approach of a train that should not have existed. As it drew closer, one impossible detail became clear. The locomotive cast no shadow. Its body looked scorched, as if forged from long-forgotten fires. The windows were opaque. The wheels turned without making a sound. But when the first rail car aligned with Samuel, the true horror revealed itself. Behind the glass stood dozens of human figures, or rather, the absence of faces. Motionless bodies, hollow, like abandoned molds of men. Workers, the legend claimed. Men swallowed decades earlier by the very railway they helped build. And every one of them was staring directly at Samuel. I had heard versions of that story back when I still wore a badge. But it wasn't until years later, reading the records and learning the names involved, that I understood. That railway wasn't built with iron and timber alone. It was built on silence. The Pacific Railway, completed in 1862, was meant to be the great triumph of America's westward expansion. Yet even decades after its completion, many still spoke of it as a structure built in haste, silence, and unmarked graves. Official records listed dozens of workers killed during construction dynamite mishaps, cave-ins, sudden storms. Unofficial accounts claimed far more. Between 1890 and 1900, old stories resurfaced among small towns scattered along the most remote stretches. Sightings of an aged train appearing only on the new moon, gliding through portions of track long overtaken by wilderness. These renewed rumors alarmed the railway company. The region's economy depended on the line's reputation, and investors wanted no association with frontier superstitions. That was when they called upon Samuel Holbrook, a private investigator known for dismantling legends and exposing the truth behind strange claims. He had unmasked bandits, uncovered elaborate frauds, and explained phenomena that seemed supernatural at first glance. Methodical, sharp, and deeply skeptical, Samuel dismissed ghost tales as the natural byproduct of exhaustion and isolation, but the recent reports were different. Experienced workers, seasoned travelers, and even local officials claimed to have witnessed the same impossible vision: an outdated locomotive, far older than any train still in operation, moving through the darkness without a single sound. And behind its clouded windows stood human shapes, motionless, featureless, staring into nothing. That was why Samuel was sent to the most forsaken section of track, where nature was slowly reclaiming every inch of what had once been imposed upon it. He expected to find little more than decaying rails and misinterpreted stories. But on that moonless night, he would learn that certain tracks do not end where they should, and some passengers never reach their final destination. Samuel reached the forgotten stretch of track at dawn, when the fog still clung low to the ground like some cautious living thing. The ancient rails, bent, rusted, and nearly swallowed by vegetation, looked more like a charred matchstick than part of an active railway. His first task was straightforward: locate the exact spot mentioned in the reports, the place where, according to witnesses, the silent train materialized out of nothing. He walked for nearly an hour until he reached an old metal milepost. Corroded and leaning, where a barely legible number -31 still clung to existence. Just a few steps beyond it, something caught his eye. The gravel between the sleepers had been disturbed, churned as if by a massive weight. But there were no wheel marks, no metallic grooves. Only a broad, deep impression of something that should exist, yet didn't. Kneeling, Samuel touched the ground. The pattern struck him immediately as wrong, too symmetrical, too perfect, like the imprint of a machine that had never been built. He documented everything in his notebook, though one detail unsettled him further. The gravel wasn't merely compressed. It was faintly scorched, as if exposed to intense heat for only a moment. Yet the rails beside it remained untouched, cool, showing no signs of thermal expansion. As he combed the area, he found something else. Small shards of metal scattered off to the side. They were thin as slivers and black as polished coal, but when he held them, they weren't cold. They hummed softly, as if holding the residue of some distant vibration. It was the first concrete clue. And, to his discomfort, it was completely inexplicable. If this wasn't the work of an ordinary train, then what exactly had passed through here? Samuel was still examining the metallic fragments when he heard footsteps behind him, too light to be a large animal, too deliberate to be the wind. Turning, he saw an elderly man, thin as a fence post, his skin weathered by sun and years. He carried an unlit lantern and wore an expression of cautious gravity. He introduced himself as Elias Moore, a former railway flagman who had retired back in 1887. Elias glanced at the dead rails, then at the scorched gravel, and slowly shook his head. "You won't find what you're looking for here," he said, voice low and resigned, "because whatever came through this stretch doesn't belong to the world you think it does." Samuel tried to steer the conversation toward logic. He showed company records, recited the recent reports, and explained the physical impossibility of a train appearing on warped track. But Elias seemed unmoved. Instead, he offered a completely different version of events. According to him, the ghost train didn't appear on the tracks, it appeared with the tracks. As if a portion of the railway itself materialized for an instant in a state it hadn't had since the 1860s. Old Man claimed he'd witnessed it once, decades ago, on the new moon of 1871. He said he heard the train before he saw it, a deep lament rising from beneath the earth. And when the locomotive emerged, the rails at his feet weren't twisted or rusted. They were pristine, gleaming. As if time itself had been pulled backward for a moment, Samuel noted every detail but refused to accept it. If Elias's account was true, the phenomenon wasn't just defying physical law, it was defying temporal law as well. For a man grounded in reason, that was the most unsettling contradiction of all. After speaking with Elias Moore, Samuel returned to milepost 31 to re-examine the area. Something in the old man's account, the idea that the train appeared with the tracks, echoed in his mind like an unwelcome refrain. He opened the railway's construction reports, fragile documents stored in a worn leather folder. Among pages stained by age, he found a note written by an engineer in 1861, a complaint about segments of track that seemed to shift during the night and required realignment with abnormal frequency. On its own, it could be dismissed as exhaustion-induced superstition. But then Samuel found something far more unsettling. In an accident report dated February 1862, he found a description nearly identical to what Elias had just told him. Train 47 emerged from a section of track that appeared newly laid and polished, though the previous afternoon that same stretch had shown advanced signs of wear. The document offered no explanation. It simply recorded the incident and ended with the bureaucratic phrase, Normal operation restored. A cold shiver moved down Samuel's spine. Two accounts, separated by nearly 3 decades, describing the same phenomenon, portions of the railway appearing to revert to an earlier state for brief moments. He began comparing dates, locations, coordinates, and then a pattern jumped out. Every occurrence, those from 1862 and those from recent months, happened under the same lunar phase, the new moon. It was the first solid link between past and present. And by the strange logic beginning to emerge, it didn't feel like coincidence. If the train appeared only during the new moon, then perhaps it wasn't crossing through time. Perhaps it was trapped inside it. With the discovery of the lunar pattern, Samuel pushed deeper along the abandoned line before nightfall. The sky was still bright, yet he sensed the environment shifting subtly as he moved farther from milepost 31. The wind, once steady, had completely died. The silence was so absolute that each step on the gravel sounded like a crack inside an empty hall. Then he noticed something strange. The surrounding vegetation leaned uniformly in a single direction, as if pushed aside by something that had recently passed, yet there were no footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. Farther ahead, Samuel found the second sign. An old railroad tie, nearly rotten, had been snapped cleanly in half with precision far too delicate to be the work of time. The wood looked as if it had failed not from force, but from extreme vibration. He pressed his ear against the rail, a habit from earlier investigations, and felt it. Not a sound, but a faint, distant pulse, irregular, like the weak heartbeat of something buried deep below. When he stood up, he sensed the air had changed. It felt heavier, denser. The horizon carried a faint metallic sheen, as though daylight itself were being filtered through an unseen layer. Samuel forced the unease aside and continued, until he saw something that made him stop instantly. Impressions in the gravel, identical to the earlier ones, except these were warm, as if made only minutes earlier. He checked his watch. There were still hours left before nightfall. Hours until the new moon reached its peak. Yet the railway beneath his feet vibrated gently, subtly, as if preparing itself. Preparing for something that, according to every account, should only appear when the sky was fully swallowed by darkness. With each step, Samuel felt he was crossing an unseen threshold. The air had grown so dense it seemed to hum against his skin, and the silence now held a strange undertone, as if a continuous low-frequency sound were buried beneath it. He advanced to a place where the rails vanished under earth and tangled roots. According to the company maps, this section had been abandoned after a landslide in 1874. No train, living or dead, could possibly run through it. Yet something was different here. The ground, littered with dry branches, carried a faint scent of old oil. Samuel crouched and noticed that several roots had been severed with uncanny precision. The cuts were charred, darkened as if exposed to intense heat, yet there were no signs of fire anywhere around. Then he felt it. A deep vibration rising from the soil, traveling through his bones and thudding inside his rib cage. It wasn't wind. It wasn't machinery. It was something older, more irregular, more alive. He steadied his breath and stared at the buried rails. For an instant, he could have sworn they glimmered beneath the dirt as if an impossible light were trying to break through. More unsettling still was the sound that followed, a distant metallic echo, like a locomotive braking slowly, muted, as though it were happening underground. Samuel backed up 2 steps. The sound sharpened. A faint, drawn-out whistle drifted through the trees, carrying the sorrow of a time that no longer existed. And then he saw it, beyond the branches, for less than a second, the silhouette of an old rail car, translucent, its edges trembling, as if trapped between 2 moments in history. He blinked, and the vision vanished. But the ground kept vibrating. The near revelation was undeniable. The train was coming. Even though, at that hour of the day, its existence was impossible. Samuel retreated to a nearby ridge, trying to steady his breath. The vibration in the ground had grown more insistent, as though something were approaching despite the late afternoon light still lingering in the sky. He opened the folder again, searching for any overlooked reference that might explain the phenomenon. That was when he found a loose sheet tucked between the 1862 reports, an unsent letter written by the project's chief engineer, Alistair Keene. The letter described an unacceptable incident during the final phase of construction. According to Keene, a group of Chinese laborers had vanished inside a newly carved tunnel after a sudden collapse. Under government pressure to complete the line on schedule, the company chose to seal the tunnel rather than attempt a rescue. Buried alive, the letter stated with chilling bluntness. But the most disturbing part lay at the bottom of the page. Keene wrote that 3 nights after the sealing, sounds could still be heard inside, not cries for help, but something resembling the echo of an approaching locomotive. A cold wave climbed Samuel's spine. This wasn't merely a legend about dead workers. It was deliberate negligence and possibly the catalyst for something that should never have been set in motion. Then he noticed another detail. The tunnel mentioned in the letter was located precisely in the area where he now stood, buried, abandoned, forgotten. The moment he connected the dots, the air around him seemed to contract. The wind returned, but not naturally. It came in uneven bursts, as if pushed by large volumes of air being displaced at unnatural speed. The ground's vibration intensified. The subterranean hum began to form a rhythm. And Samuel finally understood. The train wasn't merely trapped in time. It was bound to the deaths the railway had created. The vibration in the ground settled into an almost cardiac rhythm, and Samuel realized hesitation was no longer an option. He descended the slope, approaching the point where the buried tracks disappeared into the earth. The fading daylight warped subtly, as though the air had thickened and was pulsing outward in trembling waves. Instinctively, he brushed his hand across the soil, searching for the exact location of the tunnel mentioned in Keene's letter. And then he found it, a shallow depression, barely noticeable, like the breath of something sleeping just beneath the surface. The underground sound grew clearer. It wasn't merely a distant whistle. It was the muffled cadence of iron wheels, advancing slowly, insistently, as though moving through a buried world. Samuel stepped back, but something flickered at the edge of his vision. Not light, not movement. Something far more impossible, a shadow. A shadow stretching across the ground. Even though there was no light source that could produce it. The shape was long, rigid-edged, unmistakably resembling the silhouette of a 19th-century locomotive. He blinked, but the shadow remained, shimmering, as if trapped between now and a forgotten reflection. His pulse surged. This should not be happening in daylight. Every account insisted the train appeared only during the new moon at the height of darkness. Yet the earth trembled harder, and the shadow grew more defined, more solid, as though straining to manifest too soon. Then Samuel heard something new. Voices. Not screams, not speech. A collective murmur rising from the buried tunnel. The voices carried a chilling tone, a continuous lament, like a chorus of men caught between labor and suffering. The sound swelled and receded in waves, echoing like chants distorted by time. He stepped back farther. The air grew colder, not like an approaching storm, but an internal, unnatural cold, the kind that belonged not to weather but to presence. The shadow of the train stretched forward, advancing several feet as though pulling itself out of the earth. And for a breathless moment, Samuel was certain the locomotive was trying to cross the boundary between worlds, despite the absence of the new moon. Then a figure appeared. Not a person. Not exactly. At the point where the rails sank beneath the soil, a human silhouette began to materialize, blurred, opaque, its edges shifting like smoke trapped in a body-shaped mold. It had no face, only the faint suggestion of where features should be. But its posture was the most horrifying part. It was bent forward as though holding an invisible shovel. Its motions were slow, repetitive, the movements of a man digging. Forever, the figure turned its head toward Samuel. And in that instant, he understood the greater truth, the revelation that bound everything together. The disappearances, the rejuvenated rails, the train unbound from time, the subterranean voices. The railway had not merely buried workers alive. It had trapped their final actions. The last moments of those men, digging, lifting, building, had been frozen at the instant of death, and the ghost train was not just an apparition. It was the eternal repetition of work that never ended. An echo condemned to relive, every new moon, the moment when life and the railway were sealed together forever. Slowly, the ground stopped vibrating and began to shake in earnest. The shift was so sudden that Samuel had to brace himself. The air contracted again, as though being sucked into the earth, and then a burst of freezing wind exploded outward, scattering dust and dead leaves. The shadow of the locomotive darkened, no longer a trembling outline but something solid, very solid. The buried rails began to glow beneath the soil as if a furnace were about to break through. And then, with a sharp crack, the first sliver of iron rose from the ground, displacing earth like water. The train was rising from the underground. The locomotive, black as scorched coal, tore through the surface with a metallic groan that sounded older than the land itself. Its boilers glowed from within, though no fire burned inside. The wheels turned slowly, yet never touched the ground. They hovered a few inches above it, dragging dust in swirling motions. The air around it warped like an inverted heat haze. Samuel staggered back, but his eyes remained fixed on the impossible. The train was assembling itself, layer by layer, as though being rebuilt from the memory of the earth. Then the rail cars emerged, each pulled upward like shards from a broken mirror. Opaque windows, corroded frames, and behind every pane, human silhouettes, dozens, perhaps hundreds, all motionless, all bent in positions reminiscent of forced labor. But when the train paused for a heartbeat, every figure lifted its head at the same moment. Where their eyes should have been, there was only absolute darkness. Yet Samuel felt, not saw felt, that they were staring directly at him. The sound that followed did not belong to the living. A long, mournful whistle, as if a cry had traveled 30 years to reach him. The train shuddered, readying itself to move, and the silhouettes inside shifted in perfect unison, a single step forward as though responding to his presence. The locomotive tilted slightly, almost like an acknowledgement. And then the final truth of the climax hit him. The train wasn't merely reappearing. It was searching for someone. And for reasons buried in the past, it had chosen him. The train began to move, at first so subtly it was almost imagined, then with a steady, impossibly silent glide. The silhouettes inside the cars never stopped tracking Samuel's every movement, as though waiting for a decision or a surrender. He stepped back again, but something held him in place. Not a sound, not a sight, but an ancient instinct whispering that this train had not come by chance. On the ground, between the freshly exposed rails, he noticed marks, enormous footprints, deep as if heavy boots had passed minutes earlier. But they were impossible. The pattern was from 19th century work boots. Yet the soil had been undisturbed for decades. And still, the prints were fresh, as though left at that very moment by an unseen walker. The mournful whistle sounded again, but this time there was something new, a nearly human voice buried inside it, as though someone attempted to speak through the locomotive's lament. It wasn't any language he knew, but it carried urgency, insistence, perhaps a warning. The windows of the last rail car flickered with pale light, revealing something impossible. A figure unlike the others, less distorted, upright, almost solid. It raised an arm slowly, pointing first at Samuel, then inside the train, repeating the gesture rhythmically. Maybe an invitation, maybe a sentence. The locomotive slowed, as if waiting for his choice. When Samuel stepped back, the entire train shuddered with something like disappointment. But then something, a small metal box, fell from the side of one of the cars and rolled to his feet. He picked it up and recognized it instantly, identical to the boxes used by railroad inspectors 30 years earlier. Inside, a single object, a charred fragment of rail with the name Samuel Holbrook carved into the metal. It was impossible, painful, and left only one question. Was the train carrying souls trapped in time, or had it come to claim his? Samuel blinked, just once, and the train was gone. The wind stilled. The sound collapsed. Only the box in his hand remained warm, as if passed to him by someone living. Then he noticed, beside his own footprints was another print, deep, fresh, and not his, and it pointed toward the direction the train had gone. There was a time when I believed every road led somewhere. The railroad taught me otherwise. Some paths exist only to remind us of what was left behind. Since that night, no one has seen the investigator again, and on new moon nights, no one asks about him.